Hello, I'm Barry Bjorkman, broadcasting from Carson City, Nevada. I'd like you to picture yourself at the airport. Think about boarding your flight. Do you ever believe that the pilots of modern-day aircraft should have the ability to fly these aircraft manually, without the aid of the autopilot computer-generated systems? Hello, I'm Barry Bjorkman, broadcasting from Carson City, Nevada, regarding the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. With me today is Bill Horn. He is a former pilot of Boeing 727 aircraft, very similar to the 737 and totally familiar. Bill?
Thank you, Barry. We're going to start this with a little description of some of the news media, because I believe that when we go through the timeline of what actually happened, they will see, we will be able to point out where the news media has failed in telling the facts. I have two different examples. The New York Times, shortly after the Lion Air crash, led with headlines, "Behind the Lion Air crash, a trail of decisions kept pilots in the dark." This points to Boeing as the sole problem. I have another one dated 10/1/19. The media has been relentless on this. "Crash Course: How Boeing's Managerial Revolution Created the 737 MAX Disaster." I think as we go through this and show what's went on in the Ethiopian crash, that we can show that neither of these editors knew anything about flying. We have another one, and I would like you to read selected portions from another editorial to kind of put us on track. So if you will start with the first excerpt from page 1.
I will. Bill, thank you. I am reading directly from this excerpt, and Boeing has taken the position the pilots of the Lion Air flight should have known how to handle the emergency despite not knowing about the modification. The company has maintained that properly following established emergency procedures, essentially a checklist, long familiar to pilots from its earlier 737s, should have allowed the crew to handle a malfunction of the so-called Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, known as MCAS, whether they knew it was on the plane or not. Bill?
I'm going to support Boeing's position on this. When MCAS, which is the part that the pilots didn't know about, it was a safety system designed to stop a stall in case a pilot wasn't watching the airspeed correctly. What it does is it trims the nose down in order to return the airplane to safe operating environment. The MCAS system uses the trim, and each pilot, there's a manual trim wheel on each side of the pedestal, and anytime the aircraft is trimmed, this wheel moves. The emergency procedure for a runaway trim, which means that the system isn't doing what the pilot wants it to do, is a single item, and that is to turn the electric power to the motors off. So it's a one-item checklist. It's the shortest checklist on the airplane probably for emergencies. Would you read the second page?
Yes. On the second page, and I am quoting now directly from this document, John Barton, a 737 captain who spoke on the condition that the airline he flies for not be identified, said the blame started with Boeing and the FAA, but extended to airlines and pilot unions. Many pilots feel the training was inadequate And therefore, it appears to me that Boeing, the FAA, the airline training centers, and possibly the unions themselves are culpable for the incident that happened. Bill?
I'm going to partially agree and partially disagree. The Boeing system, although new, was within the parameters of normal checklists. The FAA allows Boeing to do certain things, and the FAA was not to blame on this either. I would agree that Boeing should have made this known to the pilots, that knowing that would be better, so that each captain would know every component of what the aircraft was, but it is not the cause of the crash. Would you read page 3?
I will. Again, I am quoting directly from this document. Boeing did not hide the modification system. It was documented in maintenance manuals for the aircraft. And airlines were informed about it during detailed briefings on differences between the MAX and earlier versions of the 737. But the FAA's determination that the system did not have to be flagged for pilots gave a pause to some other regulators.
Okay. This shows that Boeing did not hide the component, that the airlines had the information. The FAA just did not mandate it. The airlines were free to disseminate that information to their pilots. I would again say that I think it should have been in the pilot's manual also, but again, I don't believe it was the cause of the crash. Would you read page 4?
I will. Again, a brief reminder, please, to all of our listeners that I am quoting directly from those documents. At the heart of the debate is whether the pilots would have responded differently if they knew the plane's nose was being forced down specifically by the MCAS system. Bill?
Okay, the flight that we're going to talk about, I do not believe that that is the case. I believe that the pilots acted the way they did because they were in fear and unprepared to manually fly the aircraft. What I would like to do is go through this timeline and make comments. I'm going to run the clock as the timeline shows. Because it was a short flight, 6 minutes in length, and there were many things occurring, going on during the thing, some of the verbiage will be much longer than the time it actually happens, but I will be giving the times in the segments that it is so that you can see what they did in the period. So, I want to tell you that in looking at many simulations of the crash, the information on this timeline is taken from the best video simulation I've seen put out. And it's put out by the Flight Channel, and the title of this video from the Flight Channel is Boeing 737 MAX crashes immediately after takeoff. Here's what really happened to Flight 302. The other comment I would like to make before we start the timeline is that the airport elevation for the Ethiopian flight is 7,654 feet above sea level. It's a high-level airport, and when we give certain elevations, they will be above sea level, and others will be above ground level to give you an idea. So I'm going to start with the aircraft taking off. The time is 8:38 even, and the aircraft is rolling down in the simulation, rolling down the runway. After takeoff, the crew notices the captain's angle of attack indicator fluctuating. Stick shaker activates. Captain's airspeed, altitude, and pitch instruments differ from the first officers. Prior to 1,000 feet AGL, the captain attempts to engage the autopilot twice, but gets warning signals. Now, this is immediately after takeoff. It's before you hit 1,000 feet. It's in the first minute of takeoff, and we have problems. I'm going to say that the captain should have assumed at this point that he wouldn't be going on the trip, that there were aircraft instrument malfunctions and stick shaker, and that in the interest of safety, he should have decided to return to the aircraft at that point, even though he was still within the takeoff thing. But he should have known that he was going to be returning to the aircraft. The second thing that will be absent from this timeline is a mayday call. When an aircraft has problems, and they are an emergency type problem, the standard is to call mayday. That alerts the ATC, the air traffic control, to the fact that the aircraft is in trouble. It makes sure that they will clear all obstacles to getting back to the aircraft. They will reroute flights, they will give the flight priority, and they will be helping to make sure that the aircraft returns safely. There was no mayday during the whole flight. 8:39:06. This is a minute and 6 seconds after takeoff. Captain advises first officer to contact air traffic control. The first officer says tower crossing 8,400 feet, that is 800 feet above ground level, and climbing to flight level 320, which is 32,000 feet above sea level. 8:39:22. This is just a few seconds later. At about 1,000 feet above ground level, the left autopilot is engaged and pitch trim decreases to 4.6 units. I'm going to make a comment here. It is apparent that the pilot uses the autopilot for the flight portion of the trip. And he is engaging or attempting to engage the autopilot before reaching 1,000 feet. At 1,000 feet, he finally gets it engaged. So even though he knows there's a problem, he is getting it to the autopilot because that's where he seems to me that he feels most comfortable. 8:39:29 seconds. Air traffic control identifies flight 302 and instructs them to climb to flight level 340 and go direct to Rudall, which is a point on the trip route. First officer acknowledges. 8:39:45. Captain calls for flap retraction and first officer retracts them to 0 degrees. Now they're in climb attitude. The airplane is cleaned up and they should be accelerating to climb airspeed at this point. Autopilot starts turning from 72 degrees to 197 degrees to go direct to the first fix on their flight plan. Captain asks first officer to request runway heading. I would take that request as an indication that the captain has decided that they are not going to go to the destination, but are going to return to the aircraft. My comment to that is mayday. He's going to return to the airport. He should alert tower immediately so that he can get priority and any help that's available from the tower. 8:39:57. Autopilot disengages. So we have been almost 2 minutes into the flight. The autopilot's been engaged after the first minute, and now it disengages. And it disengages because it has sensor problems, and the autopilot knows that it shouldn't be flying because it knows that it's got sensors conflict. And so by design, Boeing has had the autopilot disengage when it has conflicting signals. The captain should have known that the autopilot would disengage because he saw on the takeoff, on the first portion of the takeoff, he saw instrument problems, and then he saw 2 autopilot warnings before he finally got the thing engaged. So this should be no surprise to him. Captain has first officer request runway heading and inform tower of flight control problems. So this is the first time he's telling the tower that he has some problems, but he hasn't declared an emergency yet. 0840:00, that's 8 hours 40, so 3 seconds later, MCAS moves the pitch from 4.6 units to 2.1 units, followed by nose going down and aircraft sinking. This is the first time the MCAS engages. It only engages when pilots are hand flying. So it doesn't engage during the autopilot flight, and this is the first time it did. And because of the sensors, it senses that they have a stall condition or close to. It takes 9 seconds for the MCAS to roll the trim from 4.6 units to 9 units. The fact that the trim is moving in the wrong direction, that is, the trim is moving in a descent mode as opposed to the climb, which is what they were doing, should tell the pilot immediately that he has a runaway trim. At that point, prior to the 9 seconds, he should have had the trim off much sooner. As soon as he saw the trim moving in the wrong direction, that is the emergency runaway trim, and he did not follow the procedure for that at this point. Crew uses control switches to electrically trim the nose up to 2.4 units. So the pilots on their wheels, on the yokes, captain on the left thumb position, the co-pilot on the right thumb position, can electrically position the trim. And so when the nose went down, or the trim went forward, then they reacted by bringing the trim back, and they were able to bring the trim up a little bit. 0840:05, 5 seconds later, first officer informs air traffic control that the flight cannot follow the departure route. So they are telling the air traffic control that they won't be on the flight control. MCAS moves pitch trim down to 0.4 units. This is another 2 units of nose down trim. Again, the pilot should know when the trim wheel's moving, it's moving in the wrong direction. The procedure is to turn off the electric power to the trim motors. (8:40:27). This is 22 seconds later. During the resulting descent, captain advises first officer to trim up with him using control switches to electrically trim the nose up. So captain has the first officer hold his. Both pilots are using the trim wheel, the electric trim switches on their wheels to bring the trim nose up and to correct this problem. At this point, the crew decides to disable the electric stab trim. That's the correct thing. Finally, they've done what the checklist says. This means that all trimming must be done manually using the stabilizer trim wheel. And what that means is, done correctly, the wheel on each side has a lever. And done correctly, they would pull the handles out, and the non-flying pilot would use that wheel with the lever to trim the nose to where the captain wants it. And the captain's the flying pilot in this case. 8:41:41. MCAS tries to trim the nose down and fails. That is, the MCAS gave the signal, but the electricity wasn't on, and so nothing moved. They were safe. Captain, pull up, pull up, pull up. Because they didn't trim enough with the electrical before they turned it off. They still had a tendency to be going down, and so the captain has been holding the control wheel back to keep the nose up. And he's asking the co-pilot to help him pull back on the stick to keep it up. Because the plane has nose-down trim setting, both pilots have to pull back on their control columns to keep level flight. Since the crew is focused on stab trim and have not monitored speed, the thrust levers have remained set at full takeoff power for the entire flight. Aircraft reaches 340 knots and continues to accelerate. Okay? A pilot manually flying an aircraft should be fully capable of handling the problem, handling their pitch, handling wherever they're going, and monitoring airspeed, pitch, and power settings. That is part of what a pilot needs to do when he's manually doing it. They should also be able to handle other emergencies, but they should be definitely able to handle an emergency and fly the airplane. And they have a non-flying pilot, the captain's in command. He can tell the co-pilot what he needs done, and he can maintain situational awareness. Okay, this is a breach of situational awareness that I believe has a cause. 841.20, overspeed warning sounds. This is a clacker sound. This says you're exceeding the speed of the aircraft that it's been designed for. You're exceeding design speed. Okay, and this is something, this warning continued to occur all the way through to the crash. The aircraft from this point on, this is 3 minutes and 20 seconds after takeoff, they got overspeed, and they never noticed that they never looked at the airspeed, they never looked at the power settings. And the only thing I can think is they were scared out of their wits, and they were not comfortable hand flying, and they were not operating in the correct parameters. From this point on, they are outside the design characteristics of the aircraft. 841.46. Captain asks first officer if trim is functional. First officer replies no. First officer asks if he can try to trim manually. Captain, yes, do it. Okay? For the crew to have decided to disable the trim, and the captain not to know that the trim was disabled, and having to ask the co-pilot if the trim is functional, and then having to have the co-pilot suggest that they use manual trim, and then says, yes, do it, says to me that he was in a panic, that he wasn't thinking, he wasn't flying the aircraft. First officer tries to trim manually but can't do it. Now, probably many of the investigators would assume that the first officer did it correctly. That is, that he actually pulled the handles out and he was trying to trim the thing manually according to the book. I don't know if that's the case. If the first officer tried to grab the wheel and trim it with the wheel without the handles, he wouldn't be able to move it. And I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't do it correctly, and that's why they didn't get manual trim. I don't know, because the aircraft was over-designed speed, whether it would have been hard even with the handles up. But obviously, the captain should have set the power for maintaining altitude or whatever environment he wanted. He should have known what the pitch should be, and he should have known what the airspeed should be, and flown. The first thing that a pilot should be doing is fly the aircraft first, handle the emergency second. He wasn't flying the aircraft. First officer tries to trim manually but can't do it. Crew asks air traffic control for radar heading back to the airport. Air traffic control tells crew to turn right to a heading of 260 degrees. Captain, push with me. First officer, it's not enough. Okay, what they're trying to do is, going back to the airport, they reached a height of about 7,000 feet. Now they're going to return to the aircraft, to the airport, and they are trying to push the nose forward to descend. Okay. If he were used to hand flying, number one, he wouldn't be at the speed he was. He would have noticed the overspeed. He would have brought the throttles back to idle, decreased the power. But no, he's not aware of what his power is, nor is he aware of what his airspeed is. He is just trying to push to get the aircraft down. And it's going to be hard because he's over speed, and as he pushes, he's going to continue to increase the speed, and he hasn't set the power properly. Since the crew can't adjust the trim manually, they re-engage electrically to the stab trim. Okay, and if they're trying to go down now, I would assume that they would try to trim forward, but the black box says this works, and 2 momentarily crew electrical inputs are recorded for nose up. So this is confusing, that they were going to descend, but they're trying to trim it back up. But they have re-engaged the electrical, which is totally contrary to what they should have been doing. And MCAS at 8:43:20, MCAS moves trim down without pilot input. Aircraft noses down and descends. Now they pushed it down, the system continued to nose it forward, continue going, and the pilots, although they knew the procedure and had done it once, did not do it a second time, even though there was a runaway trim, even though the nose was there. They must have been frozen. I don't know any other way to explain it. And it just put it down, and at 8:44, pardon me, 8:43:20, MCAS moves trim down without pilot input. Aircraft noses down and descends. And I mean it descends. 8:44:00, this is 40 seconds, 6 minutes after takeoff, having reached an altitude of 7,000 feet above ground level, the aircraft crashes. So they had no solution for the nose down after they had re-engaged the electrical. And we had a crash. Now, at no time during the flight did the captain ask the first officer to fly the aircraft. This is a note, and I'm going to make this point. I personally wouldn't have trusted the co-pilot to fly it either, because he was a very low-time pilot. But the captain at 8,000 hours and 9 years with the airline couldn't fly the aircraft, and stopped flying the aircraft shortly after takeoff. And when I say flying the aircraft, I don't mean just steering. I mean flying the aircraft means that you position it where you're supposed to, knowing where you're going, that you have the power settings correctly, you watch your airspeed and the rest. That's flying the aircraft. That is what you need to do to fly one of these aircraft. But he stopped flying very shortly after takeoff and reacted, and was more a passenger than a pilot. That's my opinion on it. I don't know how much from this that you could lay on Boeing, because to me this is pilot error. And when discussing what happened, you have to take a look at the fact that they're looking at how the plane was flown outside the parameters, as opposed to how it should have been flown if the pilot were doing things correctly. So that's my take on it.
Great. Bill, thank you very much. That was extremely informative. We all hope that all of you have information and or opinions. Please subscribe Please send us your opinions, your references regarding this crash, and the information involved. We look forward to seeing your responses. Thank you very much for listening.